Hello and welcome to Vital Perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Marwin Spiller, and we're here today with mayoral candidate Chama St. Louis. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We have a short amount of time, so I'm going to jump right in to some of the cutting issues that you are certainly poised to possess, to address, and the things that are happening in the city at large. I want to get into your candidacy, your platform, your vision for the city, and the things that you see as vital of importance, things that are impacting the city. So I want to start off by just tell us, who are you? I mean, who are you?
I am a Peoria resident who grew up here in Peoria on the south side. I'm a mom, first and foremost, but I'm also an entrepreneur. I'm a businesswoman, and I would say I'm an advocate for our community, an activist as well, and a candidate for mayor.
Okay. Now, what makes you poised to take on the leadership position of the city at this time, in this moment, given everything that's going on in the world and everything that's going on in the city?
I think now more than ever, especially with everything that has gone on, we need a leader who has been boots on the ground in the community, who has been at doors and had face-to-face interpersonal conversations with our residents, talking to them about what their needs are, what they're passionate about, the changes that they want to see in their communities. We need someone who has that level of empathy and who has been doing the work in the years leading up to running for office in a leadership position, because we are in the best position to know what the needs of the community are.
Okay. I want to come back to that, particularly your thoughts on what the needs are in the community.
Okay.
But I know that you've been, as you indicated, on the ground for quite a while. You've been in the trenches, some would say, being a community activist, living in the community. Was there a moment, an event, a issue that prompted you to say, I need to step this up and run for mayor?
Yeah, I mean, I think just consistently watching the downward spiral of our city and knowing, because I have been a community organizer and I had been mobilizing communities and advocating for communities, really knowing what it is that we needed in order to stop that downward trajectory. And I think it was like, why not me? You know, like, why shouldn't I step into this position? You know, I have been the one that's been in the community. I know what it is that we need. I know what it takes to turn the city around. I know how to build coalitions as a coalition organizer. And I know what startup and scalable businesses need as the former president and chairwoman of the Peoria Black Chamber of Commerce. So I possess several different types of skills that I think are very important in order to be able to lead a city.
Okay. Now, we are coming off the cuff of a very tumultuous, chaotic presidency. And America voted someone into office with no experience. At a time when things were going good. I mean, he was handed an economy that was going well. There were no pressing global threats at the moment when he came into office. People were working. When we see what happened,
Right.
you are asking the voters of Peoria to vote in yourself, who is also inexperienced in sort of, you could say, government or former government, however you want to say it. I mean, I know you have some other experiences that certainly are transferable.
Right.
But when we talk about experience governing a city the size of Peoria, I mean, what do you say to those voters? Why should they take a chance?
Our current mayor was a mayor of experience. He sat on the council for, I don't know how many years before he was elected to mayor, and look at our city. So I think having someone with no experience who hasn't done the pre-work that is required for you to be in a leadership position is very different from having someone who has experience but hasn't prioritized people. And I think that's what makes me different. I cannot be compared to Trump because Trump was doing nothing political. He wasn't advocating for communities. He wasn't doing anything that had to do with anything with being president prior to running for president. And then if we want to talk about whether or not experience makes a great leader, we can look at our current council and see how unhappy people are, and our current mayor, and see how unhappy people are with his leadership, and see that he has, he's been mayor for 16 years, and he was on the council before that. So I think it's been a total of 22 years. So I think it's not just about experience. It's about what you were doing that led up to that run. That's important. Most of the people, and I would venture to say almost all of the people, with an exception of maybe one of the people on our council, were not doing anything in the community prior to running. They were running their businesses. They were doing things that were more about self-interest and less about the interests of the community prior to running for office.
Okay.
That makes me different.
Okay. And inherent in your statements there's I hear a critique of the current leadership.
Absolutely.
And would your greatest critique be their lack of focus on people, on community? Is
Absolutely. Yep. I think when you are prioritizing residents, there are certain things that you do that our current leadership hasn't done. There's certain ways in which you engage the community around decisions. There's certain steps that you take to make sure that there is diversity and inclusion without marginalization happening, and that hasn't taken place. So that's an indicator that the focus has not been resident driven. The decisions have not been centered around what is in the best interest of the residents. It's been what is in the best interest of corporations. It's been what is in the best interest of developers. And whatever's left over goes to the residents. And so that is definitely a critique.
Okay. And I take that your platform, your vision will move the city in a different direction. Can you talk to us about your platform, your vision for the city?
Yeah, it focuses on 4 main components that will economically and socially empower our residents. So that's reimagining public safety as access to resources and opportunities, not just policing, not just more arrests, not just fire and safety. It's also reinvesting in our community. So how can we economically empower our residents? Why aren't we putting together a task force to test the feasibility of a monthly or a basic income program or a monthly stimulus program? So it's things like that. Revitalizing our older neighborhoods, spending time there. It's also rebuilding the table through participatory democracy, which basically means how are we pulling in the residents into making decisions about how their tax dollars are spent? Are we door knocking? Are we phone banking? Are we doing witness, opponent, and proponent slips? Are we setting up ballot boxes within precincts and communities to make sure that we're getting every voice that we possibly can heard before we're making these decisions that impact the community? And lastly is rejuvenating the economy. So how are we making it easier for startup and scalable businesses to grow their capacity? How are we removing red tape? How are we making it easier to provide funding? What kind of initiatives are we launching in the city to make sure that, the jobs that we have available, there's a workforce for, so.
Okay. Now, a lot of those things, a number of those things that, I've read, they're going to take some money. Some of the other things, it's going to take some investment, some political will, so to speak. In terms of those items that will require money, revitalizing communities and so forth. Certainly easier said than done. Where does the money come from, particularly given that, I mean, the city is broke?
Yeah, and I think this is where we need to have like a real conversation with city staff. We need to, one of the things that I want to do in my first 90 days or 100 days when I'm elected as mayor is to sit down with city staff and do a Q&A and talk about, the vision of the city, what the vision of my administration is, but also what are some ways that we can raise revenue that doesn't include more taxes and more fees, right? Because right now working families are carrying the brunt of our debt, and we cannot keep imposing that on working class families. Also, too, I think we can position ourselves to be a leader in the industrial hemp industry as well as a cannabis hub here. Those are opportunities that we should be exploring. As it relates to the basic income idea, that's becoming more popular here. There is a coalition of mayors called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income here, and they are implementing them within their cities. And so the funding is coming from private donors mainly, and grants, and like other corporations that are really wanting to see basic income models work. I know that $15 million was just donated to the organization for mayors to be able to use to test these pilots in their program. So right now, because it is like a hot button issue, and because this coalition does exist, funding to test it out in your city is becoming more available, and you can actually apply for that funding.
Okay. So we know that, I mean, certainly I suspect that that's a competitive process to
Well, right now there's only 12 mayors,
12 mayors.
a part of the coalition. So
Okay.
it's less of competing and more of them working together.
Okay.
So they're all helping each other. Right now, it's been tested in Stockton, California, Compton, San Francisco, Wisconsin. Chicago has put together a task force to explore their feasibility for it as well. So yeah, it's more of a helping of each other and less of a competitive type.
Okay. Now, that aside, we know that cities, raise revenue by two ways. Either, money's coming in from the state or federal government, or through taxes.
Yep.
And if we are not going to raise taxes, and we know that there's less money coming into the government, coming from the government, from the state, we know we have a gap. And given that taxes are tough because, if there are no jobs, the jobs that are here are not the jobs that were here when Caterpillar and Komatsu, and there was a sort of an industrial-based economy. And we know that high school graduation rates declining. That means that there are fewer people that are buying their homes, less tax-based, property-based, and so forth. How do you overcome that? I mean, I know you said you want to bring city workers together to have some kind of roundtable discussion. We know that you talk about hemp, but do you have any other thoughts about how you're going to bridge that gap? Because especially with COVID, sales taxes are down.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we need sales tax and we need property taxes, right? So, and in order to do that, we have to grow our population, and then we have to economically empower the residents that are here so that they're spending money and we're generating sales tax. So I think obviously the budget for 2021 has been set. But I think we have to really work towards reprioritizing how we spend money. And that's taking a look at the budget and seeing, is every aspect of the budget being spent in a racially equitable way? And if not, how can we make it more equitable? We have a wealth gap here in Peoria that is hurting us tremendously. And so we have to make some sacrifices to close that wealth gap. We have to start prioritizing small and startup businesses, and we have to start prioritizing those who are at the most disadvantaged. There's no other way to do it, right? Like we have to simultaneously work on generating revenue. So whether that's, having the industrial hemp, having a cannabis hub, bringing more cultural events or whatever it is that we need to do, we have to do that. We can't avoid that. And then we also have to figure out how do we make it a more attractive place to live across the board. And the only way to do that is to revitalize our neighborhoods. So with that being said, if we can take $8 million and give it to a developer who was just federally indicted on fraud charges, we can take those same types of risks for our residents, to empower our residents and to help grow our city.
Can you give us an example of what do you have in mind? Like what kind of risks?
Yeah, I mean,
are we
I think
talking
if I think we're right now the city is willing to take risk as far as like giving a developer $8 million, for a hotel, but we're not willing to give residents $8 million, right? We're not willing to put that $8 million into a basic income pilot and figure out that if we economically empower our residents, how does that grow our economy? How does that deter crime? And how does that make us a more desirable place to live? So we need leaders who are willing to take the same types of risks on developers and corporations to take those types of risks on individuals and people. So when I talk about our current budget and reprioritizing our spending, these are the types of things that I'm talking about. What can we go without because we're going to get a greater return on the back end?
Okay. Have you had an opportunity to see the budget yet?
Yeah, I looked at it a while ago.
Okay.
So it's, heavy on paying salaries and that sort. So, and we have about $200 million in the budget for 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, certainly we hope to have you back again, and we can get more into that when you have an opportunity to really dive into that. But in terms of investing in people, there have been a number of studies of Peoria via the United Way Community Study. I'm thinking on the exact name of it.
National Resource Network?
No, it was a study that was compiled by the United Way probably about 3 years ago.
Okay.
And the outcome of that study certainly highlighted the realities of a changing economy. That there was, growth in the health care professions and decline in manufacturing, growth in retail, for example. And what I took away from that was that it is not so much that Peoria have a jobs problem, but it's sort of like a jobs mismatch, in that the levels of education and skill set does not match the jobs that are available. And so is that an issue with our school system, or is that an issue of attracting labor to the city? I mean, how would
I think it's a combination. I think it's I think our schools need to be funded properly, right, so that they can have the capacity to ensure that our residents are equipped with the knowledge that they need to be able to go into a lot of these jobs. But also I think it is having a lack of industrial work here as well. But
we know that those jobs are not coming back.
Right.
Okay.
But also, what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
But in terms of the skills and
Oh, is it
we have a problem with our education system, but do we also have a problem with attracting labor? Do we need to attract new labor, or do we need to develop the labor we have here?
We have to develop the labor that we have here before we can attract new labor. And I just don't think that, and I do agree that it is a mismatch of what we have to offer versus what the skill set is. And I think it would do us some good to sit down and really evaluate what jobs we have available here and how to get that to translate over to the majors that people are majoring in, and which one of those really don't need a degree. that we have, and we just need to educate people that this is an option for them to be able to step into that space. So.
Okay. And you see that as a leadership issue, that you feel like you can build the capacity, the relationships, the networks,
I think it's a matter of bringing the right people to the table. And I think that it often, like, if you are not the one suffering, if your family members are not the ones suffering, it's something that can very easily be missed when plans are being made and when things are being talked about, because those in your immediate circle are all taken care of and set, you know. And so I think it's about building coalitions, building better lines of communication, and then also having the right people at the table to discuss how this can happen. I know that ICC has stepped up a lot and is doing more to kind of bridge that gap as well. And I know that Peoria Public Schools is also thinking about that and trying to bridge the gap as well. But there's still a disconnect because we still have lots of jobs that are not filled and lots of people that are unemployed. So I think it's a matter of figuring out where the breakdown in communication is.
Okay. Well, there you have it. When can the people vote for Chama St. Louis?
You can vote for me on February 23rd. That is the primary. So definitely get out and vote. You can request a mail-in ballot as early as January 14th. Okay. So please do that. Vote early if you can, and vote for me on February 23rd. Follow me on social media at Chama St. Louis for Mayor on Facebook and CSTL 2021 on all other platforms.
All right. Chama St. Louis, you've been listening to Vital Perspectives. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to keep the conversation going.
Okay.
I have a number of questions. So I want to paint a picture for you and just want to know how would a Chama St. Louis administration address this issue? What I see is that you have, if we go back to 1950, 1960, so forth, you got a family that's living on the south end of Peoria, for example, and their father works for Caterpillar. He knows that Caterpillar is a company that takes care of his workers, and that his son could work for Caterpillar because his grandfather worked for Caterpillar, and that job would always be there. Knowing that school, while that's important, you can get a job in the factory the moment you're able to work without a high school education, and with that, you can get a job that will allow you to pay for your home, shop at the mall, do whatever you need to do. And that community sort of revolved around the reality that those jobs would always be here. And so the attitudes towards education perhaps were not as developed, in large part because it was a community that thrived on labor. And Peoria, like many Midwestern towns right now, are facing that struggle. We know that we saw it in Ferguson. We saw it in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And we know we see what could happen when those jobs disappear. And as we discussed, moments ago, the jobs that have replaced those jobs are now jobs in the hospital, jobs at Walmart and the mall and so forth that don't quite pay the same wage, or they require more education. But now we have a school system and a population that is not well equipped to do that. Did leadership miss the boat in sort of modernizing the economy when it should, or are those realities that could have hit at any time? Because who could have predicted, and how would a Chama St. Louis administration address that? Because we're looking at generations.
It's like 3 questions. So yes, I do think that leadership missed the boat. And I think this is the problem that you get when you are not consistently pulling in younger generations of people who are thinking along those lines, who are hip to it and keeping up with the current trends, and really valuing what they have to offer in their advice. So I think that's a misstep. I think some of these things were just inevitable. They were going to happen, but we could have been better prepared. So that is a leadership issue. And I think it's very simple to make sure that going forward, this is not a path that we continue down. And that's by making sure that we have young people, high schoolers, middle schoolers. My daughter is in middle school. She's a coder. She builds cartoons. She's an app developer. I don't know any of those things. So when it comes to things of that nature, I'm referring to her. She already knows that she wants to go to college and be an app developer. So I think, that's one of the things when I'm elected that I'm going to make sure that I do constantly speak to the younger generation about what's trending, what's the next hot thing, what should we be thinking about, and what direction we should be moving towards. Because once we know that, then we can communicate with the schools. We can communicate with, those who are coming out into society and letting them know, like, this is what's on trend. This is what you're going to need later. It's the same situation with my own experience. When I first went to school, I went for multimedia and digital marketing and graphics. And then I was told, what is it? Why would you do that in school? You need to go and do something that's always going to be consistent. Go be a teacher or, something like that. And so I switched my major to English and education, which there's nothing wrong with that. But now I'm like, well, I'm looking at the trends and how everything is going, and I'm like, I was on the right path.
Right.
My first mind was the right mind. And so I think that we have to have, and it was older people who told me that wasn't a good idea.
Right.
So I have to have young voices at the table, and I think that we have to be intentional about seeking them out. And that's what I plan to do, but also have more diversity at the table. And in a way to where they're not just a body in a seat, they're not marginalized. Because you can have diversity and inclusion and their voices are still marginalized. So,
and why is it so difficult for young people to get a seat at the table in this town?
I think because we have a generation of people who don't want to let go. And I think that is, to put it bluntly, they don't want to let go. They don't want to share power. And I think, they think that by sharing power means that somehow they're going to lose, when it's really not. Like, we're just carrying on what it is that you started. And that's a legacy. Like, that's something to be proud of, to hand something down, that you started, and to mentor people who come after you to go on and do greater things than what you did. Like, this is how we continue to grow our society in a positive way. This is forward progress.
Okay. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them will say, young people are not prepared to take the leadership. We would love to pass this baton, but we're not convinced that you all are not going to drop it, not going to throw it, not going to...
And to that I say this, if you go back and check history and see what time did they step into leadership, it was at my age. Like, when I think about some of our current leaders now, the time where they were elected into a position, the time where they were appointed into a position, they were in their 30s. I'm 35 years old. So if you were prepared for it at 30, or you were able to get in that position and pick up quick and learn the ropes and do a good job at it and be in that position for 20 some years, what makes you think that we are not competent enough to pick up the baton and do the same thing? And if you were doing your job as an elder and as a leader with mentoring the people after you, you wouldn't have those fears, right? Because you would know, because you would have had a hand in how they were coming up and having a hand in developing their leadership. You wouldn't have those fears. So as much as, folks may feel that we're not ready, they would have to take some ownership in why they feel that we're not ready.
Okay. It's fair enough. I'll leave it there. I can go. I got, but I don't want to get you in trouble.
Okay,
because,
We're not naming no names.
And to the other point, you mentioned business, for example, and just a cursory glance of the Peoria economy will reveal that a significant portion of the businesses are private businesses. There are very few public companies in Peoria. And given the reality of the number of privately owned businesses in Peoria, why should anyone be surprised that black folks are locked out of that market in terms of higher level jobs? And that if I own a company, it's my company that I started, I'm gonna groom the leadership for that company, for my kids, for my friends, for my network, people that look like me. And therefore, how much can we explain the economic gap, the wealth gap, simply because of the way that the economy in Peoria is set up? I mean, certainly you can get a job at OSF, which is a public company, and certainly there's mobility. But for most of the other jobs, I'll hire you to work, but I'm not going to put you in a leadership position.
I mean, I think like when we're making decisions, when we're setting policy, when we're coming up with different ordinances, we have to do a better job of making sure whatever it is we're trying to implement repairs harm. And so if we know that we have an issue with a lot of businesses being private and it's locking people of color out from being able to achieve wealth that they can then pass down to, the generations after them, then we have to have a real conversation about how do we repair that harm, and then have people who are in elected positions, the decision makers, willing to actually do it. Right. And so right now, I think like a lot of the issues that we have in Peoria really just has to be, how do we fix this and really repair harm? What is a reparation for this issue, right? And then we got to have people who are bold enough to say, okay, this is how we close that gap. This is how we change the course and get things going back in the right direction. And this is what we need to do.
Right.
We don't have that, right? Like we have people who are too afraid to really stand up for the residents in the way that they should. And so therefore, it's no wonder we were rated the worst for blacks to live. It's no wonder 1 in 4 people in Peoria live in poverty. It's no wonder 70% of the students in our public schools live at or below the poverty level. Like, it's no wonder we have high crime and violence, because we are not willing to make the types of decisions. We can't just take baby steps. We have to take leaps and bounds to close the gap of what is happening in our communities. And right now we keep electing people who like to use the buzzwords, diversity, inclusion, equity, right? But when it really comes down to implementing equity, they're not willing to take a leap.
Right. And your point is well taken, and I guess what I'm getting at is that how much of that is racial, how much of that is just sheer economics, how much of that is just
it's all racial. Absolutely, it's racial. And I think here in Peoria we have to get serious about really talking about racism and the history of racism here in Peoria and how it has negatively impacted black and brown people here. Because if we're not willing to have an open and candid conversation about how racist policies and racist, systems have impacted people of color here, then we're not really ready to see changes in our city. Like, it's just smoke and mirrors.
Right. And I mean, you say that, however, I can, push back a little bit, say that we have a black woman that's superintendent of our public school system. We have an African American longtime vice president of the college. We got African American city council members. We have an active NAACP. We have African American principals. Why do we have a racial problem?
And this is no,
And I'll throw in there we had a African American chief of police.
yeah, this is no diss or no, this is not pointing the finger at any one person in those positions.
Okay.
Okay. But I say that, I'll precursor it with that and say, just because you put black people in a specific position doesn't mean that it changes a systemic issue. If you can have black people all over and still have racism, still have them operating under white supremacy. So if you are not working to change policy and laws that uphold a systemic issue and that upholds racism, it doesn't matter if you put a black person in any position. They're still operating under a system that oppresses. So we have to get serious about changing systemic problems and institutionalized issues that have kept people on the outside. And I think too often we get caught up in that. We think just because a person of color is in a position that things will change. And unless that specific person is pushing for the types of systemic issues that we need, you know, you may see some things progress and some things change, but it's not always in the magnitude that we need to feel it. And so we still have a racial problem because systemically, Peoria is still very racist.
Right. Peoria, it's approximately 26% African American.
27, yeah.
27%. Why isn't the community able to leverage its numbers to impact City Hall more than it has?
Because we have too many people in poverty. And I don't think people understand, we have too high of a percentage of that 27% in poverty. And I don't think people really understand how much poverty impacts your ability, your interests, and your capacity to be civically engaged, right? Being civically engaged is a privilege that a lot of people of color here in Peoria don't have. They're too busy trying to figure out how to make it from day to day. They're too busy trying to figure out how to feed their children, how they're going to pay the next bill. The last thing they have time to keep up with is an election with people who are not going to make any real changes in their community. So in order for us to see an increase of numbers, one, they got to have people who are running who they identify with, and people they've seen in their communities, and people who they've felt the effects of the work that they've been doing prior in order for them to even look in the direction of an election or City Hall. Right? And so I think, you know, that is a problem. When you start to work to eradicate poverty, you'll see the interest in what's happening go up, right? So prime example, stimulus. People started talking about a stimulus. Now you got everybody all over the city engaged in what's happening in Congress. Right? Because now they knew they were going to get something that they were going to feel immediately to help give them some relief. Now, obviously it wasn't enough, right? But in that moment, they were able to switch gears and lock in because they saw how that $1,200 was going to positively impact their life in the moment and take some stress off. Right? So it's the same thing. If you have people who are bogged down with poverty, it's expensive being broke. Right? So if you have people who are bogged down in poverty, they don't have time to be economically engaged. And this is why a certain class of people have ruled our city for so long. This is why we don't have any poor people on the council. And that's shameful, because we need people who come from specific communities and different tax brackets to be able to advocate for the people they identify with. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, like I say, we have a lot to talk about. I want to touch on something else. You talked about marijuana as a possible solution. Can you
Yeah.
talk to us more about that? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, just having like cannabis shops, where people can smoke freely or, network with each other and, having it as an option at restaurants or, whatever. I think we can get creative. I don't have to have all of the ideas,
Right.
but I think just being willing to be open to an idea of implementing something like that, if it could bring in revenue and ways to do it safely and responsibly,
Right.
I think we should be exploring that. It's legal here in Illinois now, so we
Right.
should be taking advantage of it, and as much as possible prioritizing Black and brown people because they have been harmed the most as a result of the war on drugs, and so yeah.
Okay. And one of the things that concerns me with that, and again, I'm just one voice, don't mean anything, but one of the things that concerns me is that our largest employer, OSF, Methodist, are largely tobacco-free campuses. And so at the same time when we are sort of elevating cannabis, we are sort of putting a number of residents in a position where they are deemed themselves unemployable because of the major employers are.
Yeah, as a city, you can, require that that's not a recommendation for a requirement for certain positions in the job. I mean, like it's not like there's things we can do.
Right.
Right. So obviously in, healthcare, you want people to be as competent as possible, you know what I mean? But we also have people who are taking certain types of prescribed drugs
Right.
and working, with a million different side effects. So I think, it really just comes down to, as a city, what will we allow, what won't we allow, and, what can be done safely and less discriminatory.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Do you feel you've been covered fairly
I've
as a
been,
candidate? I mean, I've been followed some of your discussions on
I
social
think,
media.
I think, anytime any other candidate is covered, I'm mentioned. I think, there was a problem with me just being labeled as an activist, which is not even the totality of my career. I spent more time in my work as a chamber or in my work with the Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, than anything else. So it was interesting to me how when the candidates were being mentioned and they would mention titles, everyone would get their job title and it would get to me and just say activist. And it's just like, I'm proud of my activism work. I'm never going to shy away from that. We get stuff done, but that's not my job title. It's not what I get paid to do. So you're
Right.
listing what everyone else gets paid to do, and you're listing me as an activist.
Right.
I'm a community organizer. Barack Obama was a community organizer. So
Okay.
that's my job.
Okay. So you are more than just a community.
Yeah, I'm more than just an actor, and I'm also an entrepreneur.
Okay.
And those things really speak to my ability to work in this capacity. So.
And this summer, there was a lot of social activism. A lot of that touched Peoria, and you were in the center of a lot of that. Well, you were involved. Let's say.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I was in a center. I think the younger generation really stepped up. I spoke at 2 rallies.
Okay.
I hosted 1 rally, spoke at another and spoke at 2 rallies.
Okay.
So.
And would you say that that the younger, that activist core, given your social, a lot of your social justice leanings in terms of your platform, in terms of a lot of the issues that you deem as important, is that your base? And would you call that group your base, that younger population that want change, that is somewhat sitting on the margins of change in the city? And if they don't come out, would that be an indictment of all that energy that we can say just lost, gone? I mean, what's?
No.
And I guess the question. I guess let me rephrase that.
Okay.
You know, how do we measure success of that? I mean, there was a lot of energy, a lot of demands, a lot of activity. In many ways, we can argue that your candidacy came out of that. And if you don't make it to the finish line, how much can we say that that group didn't come through?
You know,
Or is that the wrong way of looking at
I
that?
think it's the wrong way of
Okay.
looking at it.
Okay.
Right? So I think when you feel passion about a particular issue and you decide to express that in the form of like a protest, a march, a demonstration, like that's completely, it can be an isolated event. It could be something you felt like doing in the moment. Obviously, you know, we want people to continue organizing. We want people to continue raising the issues and not to go quiet. But I think it's like I'm not going to condemn anyone who is frustrated with the political process.
Right.
Because I think we have done enough. We've done enough, or we've let down our residents enough for them to be frustrated in the political process.
Right.
And I understand the amount of work that it takes to, I understand the amount of work that it takes to, like, get that switch turned in people's brain, and to like to be able to take what they're doing as a public form of support and bring that to the ballot box.
Right.
Right. So I think you know, if they didn't turn out, that's my responsibility. Right. Like that's my responsibility to prove my worthiness of their vote. It's my responsibility to show them how voting for me will positively change their life. And if I don't do that adequately enough, then I have to take that blame.
Right. Okay. I mean, and that's fair. And just, you know, a slight pushback argument is like all that voting, all that marching, all that chanting. If you don't vote, if you don't support your candidate, either at the ballot or through funds, whatever, then what does it matter? I mean, certainly,
Right.
you know, we go back to that watershed moment in history with the '60s. I mean, they protested, but they also they voted, and it,
Yeah.
you know.
So the thing that I love about change is that it kind of sneaks up on you, right? So like when I first started in my work, I was lonely. It wasn't a whole lot of people. It was maybe 5 of us that were like really pushing for social changes, like hitting it heavy, right? And so, but over time, I felt like I just woke up. And next thing you know, we have like these young people who are feeling inspired and like moving into action. And like we had hundreds of people in the streets marching for something, things that I've never seen. We had our first Black Trans Lives Matter march here. 200 people showed up for it. You know, just like, it's one of those things to where like you're planting these seeds over time and eventually a tree grows, you know, or whatever it is that you've been planting, it sprouts. And I think it's the same thing with this, right? Like, I have to trust that the seeds that I've planted over the 17 years that I've devoted my life to this work is going to pay off in the end. And I just have to keep working for it. And I never thought I would see the day where we had what we had over the summer, but it happened. And so I think, you know, for me, I can't look at it that way. I can't look at it with, you know, all that marching, all this demonstration, all this or not, or all this or that, because to me, it's not how the universe works. I think, you know, everything that's taking place and happening is going to bring about something that we're manifesting. And so obviously I wanted to manifest me as the next mayor of Peoria.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is about the bigger picture of how we are changing Peoria to become more progressive over time. And I want to correct something about my base, which, you know, yes, you know, our analytics say that people between the ages of 24 and 50 actually are my highest supporters. But then also that includes like a really big progressive community here. So obviously it includes young people, but it also includes like that Gen X, you know, generation of people who are just kind of fed up with status quo. And so out on doors, I have talked to residents who I thought would be more inclined to support a different candidate. And they were like, no, I'm tired of the status quo. Like, I want something that's different and fiery. And these are people my parents' age, you know. So now that I'm in this position, I don't peg who my base is anymore, because every day I'm finding out that there are more different types of people who support me than I could have ever imagined. So.
Okay. All right. Two more questions.
Okay.
You take the vaccine or no?
I think that's a personal decision.
Okay.
It's just like, you know, I think, shout out to, you know, the black woman, the sister who developed the vaccine. I hope that anyone who decides to take it sees good results and that it does do what it's been designed to do. I think it's a personal decision.
Okay. Last question. What do we need to know about this new normal?
Yeah, a new normal is just really a different system, right? It's a different system of centering or putting residents at the center, and everything else from that center goes out this way, right? So it's getting rid of self-interest, which we haven't had. It's focusing in on the residents, which we haven't had. And it's the obvious. It's a woman in the highest leadership position in the city. It's a black woman in the highest leadership position in the city. And it's starting something new, like letting people know that if, you know, a regular smuggler girl from the south end of Peoria can be so passionate and care about her community enough to take this risk, you know, and put herself out there to run for office and lead our city in a better direction, you can do that too. So that's a new normal.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, for your
Thank
extended
you.
time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Wish you well in the campaign.
Thank you.